All right, welcome back, everybody. How did everyone enjoy that first talk? And how did your breakout sessions go? Let us know in the chat. What an incredible day we have here, honoring the life of Terence McKenna. So love the breakouts. Great. So happy to hear that. Hello from everyone all over the world, and thank you for being here for the tribute to Terence McKenna. And welcome back. We just heard from Paul Stamets and Dennis McKenna, reminiscing on the life of Terence McKenna and all the incredible wisdom that they bring to our culture, our society, and the interconnectedness of us all. So now, for those that are new, welcome to Crowdcast. My name's Danielle Negrin. I'm the Executive Director of San Francisco Psychedelic Society, and this event is brought to you by the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy and the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. So we are going to move into our next talk for the day. Just a quick intro to those that are new. Please utilize the chat box to the bottom right. You can build community there. And if you'd like to ask a question, we're going to do a Q&A after the 1 hour talk. So ask your questions where it says ask a question, and the questions will be answered based on relevance to the talk and votes. Also, submit any art or images, quotes that you have of Terence in the green button below. And really excited to welcome Wade Davies to the next talk. And without further ado, I'm welcoming back Dr. Dennis McKenna. Dennis has been truly a thought leader in this community and has opened up the minds of many people. He has been incredibly accomplished, and he's an ethnopharmacologist focused on the study of hallucinogenic plants, the principal founder of the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, founding board member of Hefter Research Institute, and just a true honor to walk this path with. So welcome, Dennis McKenna.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Danielle, for that nice introduction. So here we are for the second half of this online fireside chat. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Wade Davis, who is an old friend of many years. And, getting both Paul Stamets and Wade Davis on the same program within the same time frame is just an incredible gift for all of us. I'm so happy that they were able to make time in their busy schedules. These are not people waiting around wondering what to do. So I really appreciate it. I will read a short bibliography of Wade Davis. It doesn't do justice to his accomplishments. Most of you already know who he is, but I'll read this and then we'll invite him into the chat room. Wade Davis is an author, a writer, a photographer, and a filmmaker whose work has taken him from the Amazon to Tibet, Africa to Australia, Polynesia to the Arctic. Explorer in residence of the National Geographic Society from 2000 to 2013. He is currently professor of anthropology and the BC Leadership Chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk at the University of British Columbia. He's author of 22 books, including One River, The Wayfinders, and Into the Silence. He holds degrees in anthropology and biology, received his PhD in ethnobotany under the legendary ethnobotanist Richard Schultes. In 2016, he was made a member of the Order of Canada. In 2018, he became an honorary citizen of Colombia. It's a great pleasure to welcome Wade to the forum this afternoon. Welcome.
Hey, Dan, how are you?
How are you?
I'm fine. I should just note that there's a little bit of audio problem there's an echo.
An echo? or a hiss?
No, it's an echo. It's not your famous hiss.
No echo on this end.
Good.
Let me see here.
Let's go ahead. Maybe Danielle can have a look at that.
Yeah, Danielle, can you help with this? I guess she's still here.
It sounds great on our end.
Okay. But Wade is hearing an echo. I wonder what's that about.
When Danielle just spoke, there was a very strong echo. Almost, but we can go ahead, Dennis. I'll work through your voice. I'll just imagine us together in the Amazon.
Okay. Okay. Well, can you hear me? Or is this echo going to interfere with?
I can hear you. I cannot see you.
Oh, you can't see me.
So Wade, it might be good to take one ear off your headphones so that will minimize the echo.
Is that better?
It's a little faint. You might want to speak up a little, but we can hear you.
But the problem, I think, is I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Your voice in particular has a powerful echo on it.
Oh, this is not good. We always seem to have these tech problems. What do you suggest, Danielle? Should we exit our browser?
I think this will. Maybe Wade, if you want to unplug your mic and plug it back in.
Me or Wade?
To Wade. And Wade, you will need your headphones. And thank you, everyone, for your patience with the technology. We appreciate all of you.
Is that better?
It's still a little faint, but you might want to unplug the headphone and plug it back in.
I just did.
Okay, perfect. And do you still have the echo?
No, it's much better.
Okay, great. Fabulous. Thank you.
And just if you could bring up Dennis on the screen would be great.
Oh, you can't see me.
So Dennis is on the screen currently.
Not here.
Not here. Oh dear. Well, I guess I should exit my browser and come back in, right, Danielle?
I'll toggle you off and bring you right back on, okay? Let's try this.
All right. That better? You see me now?
No.
So thank you for your patience. We work through this. Wade, we can see Dennis. Would it be possible to do this interview without seeing him, or are you able to? Would you prefer to see him? Okay, great.
I think we need to have video, Danielle.
Both are working.
I'm going to exit my browser. That seems to be what works, and then come back in. So just hang on, okay?
Okay, thanks, Dennis.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, it looks great on our end. If either of you are ready to begin the chat.
I'm getting a warning sign that says it looks like you're broadcasting from another window. Okay, let me see. Okay, here I am. Can you see me now?
No, I can't.
That's a mess. Let's see. That's strange. Wait a minute.
Hey, Wade.
Yeah.
Can you please refresh your page?
Refresh my page?
Yes.
Okay, is that better?
If you go to the top of the browser, go to the circle button with the arrow, and you can refresh your page there. Thank you all for your patience.
Okay.
Yeah, now I can see.
Can you see me?
There you
Or hear me?
I can hear you. I think we're all set, though.
Can you see or hear me, Wade?
We are all good to go. How are you guys doing? You ready to go?
I'm sorry, but I just lost.
This is nuts.
Dennis.
God. All right. I will. It says I can't even quit Safari. Why is that? Danielle, help.
I am here. So Wade, please refresh your browser. And Dennis, please refresh your browser and communicate
Give me instructions on how to do that, Danielle, please.
Okay, so if you go to the top of your screen on Chrome, you can see there's an arrow that looks like a circle.
Okay, I'm gonna
and thank you everyone for your patience today.
I don't see an arrow that looks like a circle. Oh, I see.
It's next to the little house at the top.
Yeah, right. So you want me to reload the site?
Reload the page, yep.
Oh boy.
All right, welcome back, Dennis. Now we are just waiting for Wade to reconnect here. Thank you all for your patience while we troubleshoot this.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hear me and see me, okay. I don't know what went wrong. It seems like it always goes off track at the most critical moment.
You know, Dennis, the internet is just overwhelmed by all these incredible people we have here today. So thanks for your patience. All right, now we're just waiting for Wade to get back on screen.
We'll get there, people. Just hang on. I'm getting lots of reassuring messages in the chat box.
We have such a supportive community.
Yes, well, they're very patient, that's for sure.
All right, I'm still waiting for Wade. He seems to be connecting. And Dennis, just a friendly reminder to minimize your chat bar so that you can be present. Okay, great. Welcome back, Wade.
Is that better?
Yeah. It's a little hard to hear you, Wade, so you might want to speak up a bit.
Okay.
Can you hear me and see me, Wade?
I can, Dennis.
All right. Don't touch anything, right? I mean, this software is great because you can have so many people, but boy, it's buggier than a Manhattan tenement, I tell you. That's so anyway, now we're past that. So thank you for coming on. I read your biblio, and I wanted to mention to our audience, Wade is a very prolific writer, and he writes on subjects pertinent to what we're interested in, not psychedelics so much, except peripherally, but he's written about 22 books, he told me. And one of the books that impressed me the most, one of his earlier books, One River: Explorations and Discoveries in the Amazon Basin, in the Amazon rainforest. I don't know if that printing is reversed on that. This is easily the best nonfiction work ever written about the Amazon, in my opinion, and it's just an incredible work. He's written many others since, but this is kind of a biography of his mentor and supervisor, Richard Schultes, but there's a lot of his own life in this, and I highly recommend this book. This is really worth reading. Anything by Wade is worth reading because he is a beautiful writer. He's also a very accomplished photographer, and he was with the National Geographic as an explorer in residence for many years, and this is just one of the volumes that he's produced from that. Are you still an explorer in residence, Wade?
No,
or is
no,
that...
I moved on. I was there for 13 years.
Okay, so you're done with that. You're now professor of anthropology at UBC, and effectively you're a national treasure for Canada. You're a Canadian native son, and you've done so much to raise people's awareness about the threats not only to the environment but to Indigenous cultures, which go hand in hand. And when you degrade environments, inevitably the people for whom these environments are home, it's their habitats, they also get tremendously impacted. And I think you're recognized for coining the word ethnosphere, which is, well, explain what you mean by ethnosphere.
Well, I think I'll tell you a funny story. I think it was 1979 when the Dalai Lama made his first visit to the United States, and he spoke the last evening of the tour at Harvard. And that same night, E.O. Wilson was introduced to a man called Norman Myers, who had written a book called The Sinking Ark, which was one of the first books to anticipate the biodiversity crisis. And Wilson and Myers were in a hall kitty corner to the main Sanders Theater where the Dalai Lama was speaking. And naturally, all the students and the faculty were there to listen to His Holiness. And E.O. Wilson, probably the most legendary biologist of our era, as kind and decent a man as you'll ever meet. But in introducing Myers and apologizing for the sparse audience in that hall, he literally said, and I quote, "If even Harvard students can't get their priorities right and they'd rather be across the way listening to that religious kook, you know how far we have to go to educate the public at large." And Ed Wilson would be the first to regret those words today, but they in fact reflected a kind of chasm that existed at the time between biologists and social scientists or anthropologists. The biologists tended to see people, indigenous people in particular, as part of the problem, and anthropologists couldn't abide the misanthropic elitism of the naturalists. And I must have been the only student that night running back and forth between the two talks, because I had the strongest sense that the same forces that were eroding cultural diversity were, of course, eroding biological diversity. And so when I began to work at National Geographic as part of their conservation initiative, I was their social anthropologist, and my mandate was quite literally to change the way the world viewed and valued culture in a decade. And so I coined that term ethnosphere to try to create a kind of organizing principle so that people would come to realize that just as there is, in fact, a biological web of life that we know so well as the biosphere, so too is there a cultural web of life, and they're interconnected. And in fact, the forces that affect the one impact the other. And indeed, the plight of the ethnosphere is, if anything, more dire, because no biologist, for example, would suggest that 50% of all forms of life, or more of it, are on the brink of extinction. But that, the most apocalyptic scenario in biological diversity, scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. The fact that in the year we were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Today, fully half of those aren't being taught to children. So, you know, one of the ways that we tried to shift the thinking on this was through storytelling. You know, we knew that politicians followed, but rather rarely led. We knew that polemics could never be persuasive, but storytellers can change the world. So for those 13 years of geographic, I would go out, if you will, into the ethnosphere to find stories of human culture that were so wondrous, so dramatic, that our audience hopefully couldn't help but come away with a new appreciation of the wonder of culture, the fundamental idea that every culture has something to say and each deserves to be heard. And you know, thinking of your brother, and that brings us right back to the kind of mysterious, magical, elegant alchemy of ayahuasca. And I was thinking so much about your brother today, you know, in anticipation of this moment. I realized, Dennis, that in so many ways, and those of you who don't know, Dennis and I have been extremely good friends, brothers, really, for, gosh, Dennis, believe it or not, it's over 40 years. And,
Hi, Wade. Wade, I'm sorry to interrupt here. It's a little bit challenging to hear you. So if you could please speak up quite a bit so that we can hear you.
Can I what?
Can you please speak up a bit
Oh.
because we can't hear you. We're having trouble hearing.
Oh, okay. I'm also getting an echo on your voice, so we'll just have to power through this.
Yeah.
I was just reflecting that, you know, Dennis and I have been friends for 40 years, but I actually knew Dennis and Terence, in a sense, long before I met them. I think it's difficult, given how ayahuasca has sort of become almost part of the contemporary zeitgeist. It's difficult for people to recall how obscure a medicine this was. I remember when I was 19 and I rapped on the door of Professor Richard Evans Schultes' fourth floor Erie at Harvard. And those of you who don't know that of him, he was the man who, in 1941, in a sense, sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the so-called, rather 1938, discovery of the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico. And I rapped on his door and I said, I saved up money. I want to go to the Amazon and collect plants as you did. And rather than quizzing me for my credentials, he just looked across the mounds of specimens and asked me when I wanted to go. And 2 weeks later, I would be in the Amazon where I would stay that first sojourn for 15 months. But just before going to the Amazon, I dropped by his office seeking some pointers that would placate my mother back in Canada. And he had 3 great pieces of advice. He said, don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck. Don't forget to bring a pith helmet because in 13 years in the Amazon, he had never lost his bifocals. And his final piece of advice was that I was not to come back from the Amazon without trying ayahuasca. And the amazing thing is that you could have told 1 million people in America in that year that you were off to try to find and understand the mystery of ayahuasca. And not one in 10,000 would have had the foggiest idea what you were speaking about.
Exactly. What's ayahuasca?
And I remember in 1974, in South America, I connected to one of Schultes' prize students, his real protege, Timothy Plowman, who had a very large grant to study the ethnobotany, ethnography, and taxonomy of Coca, the divine leaf of immortality. And Tim and I traveled around South America for 15 months. And in the early spring of 1974, of course, near Sibundoy, we hooked up with Pedro Wahibioy, who had been a great colleague of Schultes, a Kamsa healer and botanist. And with Pedro, we took ayahuasca. I did for the first time. And in the wake of that, I remember Tim telling me about these crazy brothers who were somewhere off in the Northwest Amazon, and that they had written a book called The Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching. And gives a sense of where we were all at that time. That just sounded like the most sensible title I'd ever heard of. And so I had this idea in my head of who could be these brothers. And then we finally connected in Iquitos in whatever it was, Dennis, 1980.
1981, January
1981. It felt like I'd known them forever.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's the time. I don't think, I mean, you and I had encountered each other a couple of times because you were at UBC briefly when I was a graduate student there. Then you went on to Harvard, and I continued to study with Neil Towers. And then when I was doing this, the fieldwork phase of my research, it's a long story, which there probably isn't time, but you were there with the Institute of Ecotechnics and the Heraclitus and all that, which I talked about in my book. And we went downriver from Iquitos to Pebas and up the Rio Ampiacu. We were looking for ukuhe, and this obscure Witoto hallucinogen. And you had been kind of roped into becoming the chief science officer for this Institute of Ecotechnics sponsored expedition. Well, the Heraclitus, on its way up the Amazon, had run into a barge or something. So it was in dry dock. It wasn't going anywhere. So the original plan was we were going to go down to Pebas and collect from there, looking for this obscure Witoto orally active Virola derivative. Well, the Heraclitus was not available, so then we ended up going down there, and we hired a couple of other boats and went down. And Terence, although he wasn't officially part of the expedition, he chose to join us at this phase and came with us. And it was kind of a strange expedition, because we had Wade, who was really the only person with any experience in the field, and the graduate student Don McCrae, myself, and Terence, and then the people from the Heraclitus, the two folks that they had designated to go along with us, because they lent us one of the boats. And we went down to Pebas, and then we went upriver to this place called Pucurquillo. And it turns out, no surprise, there were mushrooms there. I mean, you encounter mushrooms just about everywhere in the tropics where you find cattle. And Pucurquillo, this little Witoto village, was one of those. So, we weren't looking for mushrooms. That was not the agenda. The agenda was to find these Virola derivatives. But Terence was there, and Terence is ever the provocateur, right? And he likes to stir things up. So he was all about, we want to repeat the experiment at La Chorrera, right? And I told him, no, we don't. That's not what we're here for. This is an ethnobotanical expedition. This is my research. We're not going there. And so he knew I wasn't going to be on board. So he spent a lot of time kind of egging on the other people, Richard and Moon Dancer, the Heraclitus people. And we took some mushrooms.
I think that really says a lot about the two of you in a way. I don't know if you had a chance earlier today, perhaps you did, to let people know how remarkable your research was. And this whole question of the synergy between the various chemical constituents of this potion, yahe, or ayahuasca, is remarkable. I mean, this is probably the single most remarkable example of the shaman's genius as a natural philosopher. Richard Spruce first reported as a European yahe or ayahuasca in the 1850s. But really it was Schultes who began to drill down on this. And really interesting, and the fundamental story, which Dennis certainly could tell you better than I could, but these tryptamines are orally inactive. You can't take them through the mouth because they're denatured by an enzyme in the human gut monoamine oxidase, which is why so many
Right.
indigenous people use entheogenic substances that are tryptamine based as snuffs, as in the case of the Yanomami and the Benet, or as other means of administration. But you can't normally take them through the mouth unless there is some other constituent that momentarily denatures the enzyme and therefore potentiates, in effect, the tryptamines. And it turns out that ayahuasca is a shrub with the tryptamines and a liana with beta carbolines that serve that purpose. But
Right.
the real question is how, in a flora of 70,000 species of vascular plants, did the indigenous people learn to identify and combine these two completely distinct, morphologically speaking, denizens of the rainforest to create this powerful synergistic effect, the kind of holding grid in the sum of the parts? Now, the only scientific explanation is trial and error, which statistically is quickly exposed as being a meaningless euphemism. When Schultes was with the Siona and Sequoia in 1941, he identified 17 different folk varieties of the woody liana, Banisteriopsis capi, all of which were referable to his Harvard-trained scientific eye as the same species. And yet Shaman identified these different varieties consistently in the forest, used them in different ways, and recognized them consistently over some distance. And when he finally
Yeah.
asked them the basis of their systematics, their classification, they looked at him as if he were a fool, because any proper botanist would know that it took each one of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each one sang you in a different key. Well, this was a real breakthrough for Schultes, because he realized, really for the first time, a little bit like that line from the Dylan song, you know there's something happening here, but you don't know what
You
it is.
don't know what it is.
You
Yes.
don't. And ironically, Dennis, I'm pretty sure you're well aware of the fact that the first person to actually collect a voucher botanical specimen of the Psychotria was none other than William Burroughs, who was with Schultes at
Was
that time.
William Burroughs.
It was
Right.
the William
Right.
Burroughs.
Yeah.
Now, this also, and then of course, Homer Pinkley went on. But to the people in the audience, you really have to understand that you're looking at the guy, Dennis, who really worked this out. It's an extraordinary ethnopharmacological breakthrough, because it gives people like me, who are really advocates for indigenous people, just the argument we need to suggest that these people have something to say, that every culture deserves to be heard, and so on. And so that's what was so fascinating, is the reason we went to Rio Ampliaco in 1981 is because Schultes had reported among the Bora and Witoto, who were originally people of Colombia, of the Icaro who'd been pushed into Peru during the rubber era. He had reported that orally active tryptamine-based substance. If so, what was going on? And that's what Dennis figured out. And certainly he can share that story with us, but this brings us back to what we were doing on that river. Now, the amusing thing about it is that the reason there were mushrooms there were because the missionaries had brought in cattle. The Bora never used mushrooms,
Right.
and every day we would go out and make these oral preparations, and every night Terence and I would sit by Dennis's hammock as he dosed himself to see what happened. And it took some time because nothing was happening. And I remember one day I walked by and I saw Terence. But Terence was, those who remembered him, he was like kind of a thread of lightning with mustache. I mean, he was tall and lanky with this massive insectile head that just radiated curiosity and ideas. That head was sitting on a stoop in this kind of broken down settlement, and he had in his hand a vial of pure DMT, crystal DMT. And as Dennis said, I was in some vague sense not the head of the expedition, but sort of the responsible one as the ethnographer, if you will. And I said, Terence, what do you have out here for? You know, dosing shaman with pure drugs, exactly in the ethical handbook. And Terence was the funniest, wittiest person I ever met. And he looked up at me and he said, Wade, you know these fucking shamans, they're always messing with dosage. I just brought this shit along to let them know what kind of ballpark we're used to playing in. I mean, and then I remember another.
Right.
He also was very uncomfortable in the forest. You know, he was in his head. That's why he loved to just pontificate, and he had the Irish speak for the gap, and he was totally irresistible. But again, one day I walked by him, he looked absolutely miserable, and I said, "Brother, what's the problem?" He said, "Wait, I feel like a crystal of sugar on the tongue of a beast. Solution."
Yeah.
How does he come up with these lines, you know? And that to me was a big part of his charm. You know, when I think of Terence, if we really think what he contributed, I mean, personally, I always thought some of his ideas were really out of the realm of Blarney. I mean, his powerful idea that much of the origin of religion, my sentiment would be that the origin of religion is the mystery of death, the inexorable bounds beyond which life as we know it ends and wonder begins, and how people rationalize that inexorable separation generally defines the metaphysical worldview. But be that as it may, he played a very valuable role if you think about it. You know, the kind of discovery of these substances began at this very small cohort of the most eclectic group of people. Albert Hoffman experimenting with ergot, which led, of course, to the legendary discovery of LSD and the most momentous bicycle ride in history in 1943. Richard
Right.
Schultes, never west of the Charles River, first family to go to college, has to do a term report, has so much homework, he rushes back to the back of the lab and just deliberately picks the tiniest, thinnest book he can possibly choose of the options, puts it into his satchel, takes it home to his tenement in East Boston, and that night history is made because that thin volume was the only monograph then available in the English language that described in 1933 the stunning pharmacological effects of mescaline. And he went back to his professor the next day and he said, I must know that plant. So with another eclectic figure, a kind of Freudian anthropologist, Wes Labar, who would write a definitive book on the peyote cult, the two of them jump into a 1928 Studebaker that West has traded a train ticket for, and they blast and rumble over the dusty roads up to Indian country in Oklahoma, and this young boy is never west of the Charles River, takes peyote 3 and 4 days a week for 8 astonishing weeks of his young life, and he does not come back to Boston the same. Gordon,
Hey, Wade.
the banker, married a Russian. They love mushrooms. He concocts this idea that somewhere on earth there's a culture that worships mushrooms. And then Robert Graves somehow sends him Schultes' 1940 paper, obscure paper from American Anthropology, describing his discoveries in Oaxaca in 1938. And Washington makes a beeline for Mexico. My point is, these were this extraordinary, eclectic, small group of scholars. And then the whole psychedelic thing explodes. There's a new generation, but then there's a hiatus, 80s and 90s. And your brother, in a sense, kept that dream alive, kept alive the idea that these substances were worth engaging. You remember back then, Dennis, all of our mothers and fathers said, don't take these things, you'll never come back the same.
Hey, Wade.
Yeah.
Not come back the same.
Our host is interrupting. We have
Sorry.
problems?
Sorry to interrupt again, but There is an issue with Wade's sound again, and we're having a really hard time on making out what you're saying. So we are going to take a 5-minute break, and Wade, we're going to check your mic and figure this out. And Dennis, if you wouldn't mind chatting with the group for just a few minutes, and we'll be right back to make sure that we can get the sound back on track.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I'll stay in the chat room here. So Wade has related a lot of the time that we spent together in 1981, and really that's the time when we really got to know each other. And Terence was was part of this mix. Wade gives me credit for figuring out the mechanism of action of ayahuasca. I can't really accept that in some ways. What I did was I just, by the time I got to my work that I ended up doing, people had a pretty good idea that it was this synergistic combination of the liana, the ayahuasca vine itself containing the beta carbolines, which inhibited MAO, and then the admixture plant, which was the source of the DMT. And DMT is not orally active if it's taken by itself, because monoamine oxidase in the gut inhibits it. So these indigenous people, I would call them experimental ethnopharmacologists in a way, somehow figured out that this combination would be a synergistic combination, and that was the basis of ayahuasca. And there's been new data that's emerged in the last few years, and it seems clear that this discovery didn't only happen once. It happened in several times, at least twice, because the composition of the ayahuasca north of the Putumayo, which we call yahe, is somewhat different. Well, the admixture plant, for one thing, is different. It's Banisteriopsis, but instead of Psychotria, which is the most common admixture, it's actually another liana in the same family as Banisteriopsis called Diploteris cabarrhena. The leaves of Diploteris contain DMT. So the chemistry is the same, but the plant sources are not quite the same. And that was the basis of the project I was working on. I was investigating this orally active hallucinogen based with a tryptamine-based hallucinogen derived from completely different plant sources. In this case, Virola. Virola, the sap of Virola is used to make snuffs in different parts of the Amazon, particularly by the Yanomami Indians. And in that case, oral activity is not a problem because you're not going through the gut. So that's why they're active. I was interested in the Witoto preparation because they are orally active. And the question is the mechanism the same? Is there another plant containing beta carbolines, or are there beta carbolines in Virola? And that was kind of the focus of my thesis. And as it turns out, it turns out it was something different. There are beta carbolines in the Virola preparations, but not enough to be active. So it's some different mechanism for the oral activity. The other interesting thing about these orally active preparations, which are, a dying tradition, the knowledge it was disappearing when we went there in 1981. The informants that we interacted with were, they were shamans, they were plant medicine people, but they remembered it as something their grandfathers did or their fathers did. They gamely attempted to replicate the formulations, and we made some photographs of that. In fact, Wade was with us, and we have his beautiful photographs documenting this preparation process. But at the end of the day, it turned out to be a different mechanism. And also in the samples that we collected, it was kind of a testimony or evidence that this knowledge was being lost because I think we collected a total of 7 or 8 samples. We bioassayed them all in the field, and only 2 of them were active in terms of having a detectable effect. So this speaks to what Wade has discussed in terms of the ethnosphere, you know, this notion that just like we have, the planet has a biosphere, an atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, the ethnosphere is the coating or the layer of culture that envelops the planet. And this is where the knowledge resides. This is like the collective memory of indigenous people. And I think the concept is extremely interesting, because just as we are putting lots of pressure on the planetary systems, the ethnosphere is not exempt from this. Acts of environmental destruction and pushing all of these parameters that are trying to keep things in equilibrium impact, obviously, the habitats where people live. And the Witoto are a good example of a culture that was quite thriving prior to the rubber boom in the early part of the 20th century. And then because the newly nascent rubber industry in the Amazon was basically based on slavery, these indigenous groups, the Witoto and other related groups, which were originally based at La Chorrera, north of the Putumayo, which is where Terence and I went in 1971, they were forcibly relocated south of the Putumayo to these areas that you know, upriver from the town of Pebas. That's why in 1981 I could go back there and find, you know, not going back to Colombia, but going to Peru. I could find the remnants, essentially, of this culture, of these cultures. And it was clear that they had forgotten a lot. And they had, you know, it was not a, you know, they were losing their traditions. And so we were trying to recover a knowledge that was disappearing. And they were always very protective of it. You know, it's not something that they really wanted to share with the outside world. But at that point, when we went there, the people that we contacted weren't really part of the tradition. They were trying to replicate something that their ancestors or their, you know, their grandfathers and fathers had done. And they made active preparations, and about half of them were active. And then when we got the materials back to the lab, we could analyze them and see the correlations that, you know, and we had a very interesting day, a couple of days going into the field. The Virolas are commonly known as kumalas in the area, and kumala is kind of a generic name for any Virola species, and they know many varieties of kumalas. So we went out and we collected all these different kinds of kumalas. And the shamans with us, they would look at it, they would smell it, they would taste it, and they would say, this one is strong, this one is fuerte, it's good for making the medicine. This one over here, not so strong. And when we got all these samples back to the lab, 100% of what they had called was proved to be true. In other words, the samples that were low in alkaloids, some of them didn't even have alkaloids, and they made the correct judgment on all of those. So, you know, this is indigenous knowledge, this is folk knowledge, and that doesn't mean indigenous people are programmed to see more in their environment than we are. If someone like me goes into the field, I'm a literate person, I'm a Western person, I am programmed not to see things, right? I mean, we, as Western literate people, we put things in the background. For indigenous people, the background, what goes on all the time, that's the world they live in. You know, it's not background for them, but we miss it. And we have to actually, psychedelics help to recover that. Psychedelics, as I've often said, bring the background forward. They temporarily disrupt this default mode network that is now the buzzword. And the default mode network does a great deal. I mean, a lot of the function of the default mode network is to filter things out. And they don't get those through those filters that we have created through, you know, essentially cultural constructs. Indigenous people don't have that. They don't have the same kind of, they don't really have a default mode network. So the way they apprehend the world is very different than we apprehend it. So yeah. What else? What else should we talk about here? It seems like I'm on my own for now. Yeah, I'm disappointed. I did want to mention that Wade has another book coming out. He has many books, and I'll wait for him to come back, and hopefully that will happen. Looks like a serious technical glitch here. Let me see what's going on. I'll look at my. I don't know. We'll just have to be patient. So what I could do is I could answer some questions. Let me see what's here. Yeah. Couple of questions here. I don't know if I don't know if they are I don't know if they're rated, but one of the questions here is: could a worldwide brainstorm and assembly empowered by the internet and the psychedelic experience be a tool for accelerating the novelty and innovation needed to avoid ecological collapse? I think that the answer is kind of obvious. I think that we're witnessing this right now. You know, we've been forced to abandon our usual mode of life by this virus. We're all hiding inside or locked down voluntarily in most cases, and we're discovering innovative ways to use the internet to connect with each other. And I think this is a encouraging sign, because we do have to we have to accelerate the way that we share information. It's urgent that we get together and come up with answers, come up with possible solutions. And that's happening. I've often said that psychedelics like ayahuasca and mushrooms particularly, they are messages from Gaia in a certain way. These are messenger molecules from the planetary mind. And the message primarily is wake up. You know, we as a species are very good at ignoring the challenges that we face, you know, and we have done that for years with respect to the destabilization of the ecosystem, the equilibrium, the mechanisms that hold the biosphere in equilibrium. There's very little doubt that the planet is sustainable, is a sustainable environment by life, for life, because of life. Life maintains those critical conditions: atmospheric composition, the temperature and pH of the oceans. All of these things are these don't happen by accident. These are evidence of the homeostasis that life modulates. So, you know, we're learning. When people take psychedelics, I think they're a wake-up call. And I think in the latest development with the COVID virus, we're seeing this process kind of in miniature, in a certain sense that, you know, we knew the virus was coming. We knew long before it had emerged really on very many people's radar that it was likely to happen. And we didn't respond. We just denied it, just didn't want to hear about it. And now we're in a situation where it is a global pandemic, and it's much worse because we made no effort to prepare for it. And now we're living out the consequences. So the same thing can be said, perhaps, for the planetary crisis, climate change, often under that umbrella, but the disruption of these planetary processes. I remember when I was a senior in high school in 1969, and I was going to school in Grand Junction High in Colorado. And every morning when I got to school, I would go to the library and look at Science Magazine. They subscribed to Science Magazine. I think in 1969 is the first time that I saw an article in Scientific American. No, it was in Science Magazine, and it was called Global Warming. Who ever heard of global warming? You know, I mean, it was, and that was the first time I saw an article on that. And I thought, that's interesting. Probably everyone who saw that thought that was interesting. I didn't see it as an alarm that, you know, would everyone would be talking about in 30 years. Danielle, what's going on?
Yeah, so Wade's mic is back in action, and I'm just waiting to invite him back to the screen. And thank you all so much for your patience with that, and thank you, Dennis, for holding it. And we're going to get Wade back on screen shortly.
Yes. Sorry about this. It's always the tech that undermines you, but it's worked pretty well so far. I really appreciate your patience. Someone here on the chat has asked, Wade mentioned that some shaman ingested plants, having them sing under the light of a full moon, and the plants would resonate in a key to them. I am not sure where you can find information on this specifically. There is a very interesting book called Singing to the Plants by Stephen Breyer. And he talks about this, the role of the Icaros, the magical songs, in driving and sort of modulating the ayahuasca experience. And the, you know, the people have, the shamans do recognize these plants as having specific songs or specific resonances. And these are not things that would be apparent to a botanist. To a botanist, visually, they would all look the same. But these are real features of these plants. So again, this is just an example. If you shift perspective a bit, as the indigenous perspective does, then you see things in the real world, in nature, that we're just opaque to. You know, we are not aware of them until somebody points them out, and often the psychedelic experience can bring these background things forward, and once you see it, it's actually there, but you've never noticed before, but then you realize that's an element of reality that just escaped attention. So, all right, Wade.
Hey, Dennis.
It's been rough, man. I'm trying to keep it going here. Did you get it straightened out?
I think so. I hope so.
Okay. It sounds much better.
It's good.
Where were we?
Well, I think I was just mentioning that I think that Terence played a really important role in kind of bridging the kind of early excitement about the potential of entheogenic plants and psychedelics, if you will, through a period where you know they almost gone into hiatus, if you will, and now we have this incredibly exciting resurgence of serious work. I mean, I think one of the things that I find so fascinating, Dennis, is that if we look at the extraordinary transformations that we live through as young people, you know, women going from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. You know, when we were kids, just getting people to pick up stop throwing garbage out of a car window was a great environmental victory. Nobody spoke about the biosphere or biodiversity. Now these terms are part of the vernacular of school children. You know, we that vision of the Earth from space, you know, really was catalytic and will be spoken about for a very long time. But when we look back at the ingredients in that recipe of social transformation, the one ingredient that seems to be consistently expunged from the record is that millions of us lay prostrate before the gates of awe at very pivotal points in our young lives, having taken some curious entheogenic substance. And I tended to be more on the side, I suppose, of Ram Dass, who famously said, "You get the message, you hang up." I think George Harrison had a similar kind of sense of the substances. You know, do you need or how do you benefit from repeated use? Whereas other people find an almost ongoing therapeutic exposure to these substances very revelatory. I'm not judging it either way or not, but the bottom line is I can say that I wouldn't write the way I write. I wouldn't think the way I think. I wouldn't understand the natural world and appreciate it as I do. I wouldn't treat women or gay people the way I do. I certainly wouldn't have become the person that I am had I not taken psychedelics. I personally consider it every bit as important as anything, on orders of magnitude greater, in fact, than what I learned in any classroom. And I'm someone who has great reverence for academic training and knowledge. But these substances really have unbelievable capacity to break through into realms of the imagination that simply are inaccessible to us in other ways. I mean, when Wasson famously said that to try to explain to you know, someone who hadn't taken these substances what the experience was like trying to teach a blind man what it would be like to see. And I think that's really, really true. And I think your brother played a role in keeping that alive. He was always very you know, glib as he was, and as much of a kind of entertainer as he certainly could be, he always had a very deep respect, reverence, and spiritual engagement with these substances. And I think in that sense, he played a very important role.
Yeah, he kept the conversation alive at a time when it was not popular to be out in public talking about these things. But what you said is exactly true, you know, and we touched on this when Paul was on. You know, I mean, the reason that psychedelics were so threatening to society when the LSD came along was that it caused people to question a lot of things that were just accepted. You know, totally. Like, for example, the status of women, the status of gay people and minorities and all that. I loved what Rick Doblin said once. He said, people don't take psychedelics to have a psychedelic experience. They take psychedelics to have a human experience. And this is what they are. They are teaching tools to help us become better humans.
Absolutely. And they
more tolerant.
And you know, and it touches upon a very, you know, you mentioned how subversive they are, and of course they are. And you have that wonderful quote that flashes around the internet on that very theme. Of course they were subversive. Of course we weren't going to come back the same. But this touches upon something very deep in the history of human religious aspiration. You know, I've always maintained that, you know, religion, if it was born of the mystery of death, it was born of the hunt, because as Joseph Campbell famously says, you know, the terrible thing when you're a hunting society is that you have to kill the thing you love most. And how people came to terms with that determined their religious orientation. And shamanism was born in that distant era when most human beings were indeed wanderers on a pristine planet, hunters. And the essence of shamanism, of course, is direct visceral experience of the divine.
Right.
The shaman doesn't serve as an intermediary. He serves as a facilitator in that sense. And of course, as Campbell so powerfully and succinctly put it, the birth of organized religion also meant the death of the shaman, in the sense that the whole role of the priest is not to facilitate the individual's personal liberation, but rather to socialize that individual into a collective, which is the congregation, which is, of course, a tool of both, in some sense, control, but also it is the kind of essence of who we are as a collective species, a social species. But so what we were doing in these direct, visceral experiences of the divine weren't as elegant and as deeply grounded as the shamanic traditions that you and I have studied. But at the same time, the direct visceral experience spoke to that individual liberation in a way that, of course, was by definition subversive. You know, I'll go out on a limb here and tell a story that I've never told in public, but I think it's really worth telling. You know, I grew up in logging camps in British Columbia. I fought fires when I was 15. I had never met a gay person. I didn't even know what homosexuality was. And suddenly I find myself in South America, having connected to the most extraordinary human being I have ever met, Timothy Plowman, Schultes' great protege. Tim turns me on to being with the Arawakos, the elder brothers. He turns me on to ayahuasca, San Pedro cactus. He turns me on to yoga. He turns me on to botany. He teaches me Spanish. He basically takes me as a boy of 19 and opens up a world beyond my imaginings, a world in which I've been lucky enough to explore all of my life now at the age of 66. But at the same time, this was 1974. And Tim, in retrospect, even though at the time he was so stunningly handsome that he would walk into a room and both man and woman would swoon, he had a girlfriend, a legendary girlfriend, Teza. But he was, in retrospect, he was coming out as a gay man. And he kind of fell in love with me. He was 30 and I was 20. And I discovered what so many women go through. Oh, you love me, why don't you sleep with me? That kind of thing. And this was sort of getting in, and Tim was also as totalmente sinvergüenza. He was shameless. He would hit on anything, you know, and that was part of his charm. But the point is, it really became a problem. It was an impediment because I was frightened of it at the age of 19 or 20, right? And then one day, with another friend of ours, Leo, who Tim was also, of course, hitting on, who was also as heterosexual and as I was. And I had nothing against homosexuality. I just had never experienced it. And it wasn't who I was. So, you know, try as I might, it wasn't me. But the point is, Leo and I and Tim were in the Macarena in the middle of the most beautiful eastern reaches of Colombia. And I think this was before ecstasy, but we had this heroic dose of MDA, I think it was, that I don't know where we got. And we all took this, and all the native kids were spying through the bushes and seeing us naked on the edge of this incredible cliff face looking out into the paradise of the Amazon. And they ran back to their fathers and shaman and said, the gringos are drunk. Well, we were just extraordinarily high. And in the middle of this, I suddenly looked at Tim's naked body. Now, you have to understand, I grew up in logging camps, right? And I'm looking at him, and of course, I'm high as a kite, and I look at his genitalia. And I just start looking closer and closer until I reached out and put my hand beneath his flaccid penis, and at the age of 19 or 20, started flipping it up in my hand and saying, is this all I'm afraid of? Is this all I'm afraid of? And right there, everybody laughed, went on and had a marvelous experience. And right then, like Zazen, I broke through and came to confront whatever those fears, whatever those ghostly voices of my society were. And I became, frankly, the least homophobic heterosexual that I think's ever walked the earth. But that's what I'm saying. I say that proudly, because this is what these substances can do. turn a life around, a thought around, a dream around, a possibility around in an instant.
I think, yes, you shared this story before with me, and I think it speaks to what psychedelics enable us to do, to step out of our reference frame, to actually step into someone else's reference frame, like you did with Tim, and suddenly these shibboleths, I think is the term, they evaporate, because you realize.
And it doesn't mean like in that case.
In that case, what is sexuality?
Yeah, exactly. But the cool thing is, it didn't mean that I was any less heterosexual, and I wasn't as interested in, women on that expedition of ours as he was in men. It's just that it just took that block and just evaporated it. And I mean, I can't imagine how many, I don't know what, months of therapy or whatever you'd go through to have that kind of instantation. And of course, I would go further. I mean, that's one kind of almost amusing example, but I remember once, Tim and I found a new species. I mean, the other thing that was so crazy about all of us, including Terence, is that, Schultes used to say that Tim and I ate our way through South America. If we found a plant that even had the vaguest taxonomic relation to anything, we just take a big whack of it. And I remember we found a new species of Trichocereus, as it was called there, back in Bolivia. And I prepared it, and we took this big whack on the way down to the Yungas of Bolivia. And we had this, we didn't know what it was. And, it's full of mescaline, and we began to get a little queasy. We didn't know if it was the onset of the experience or just a downright poisoning. And then suddenly the stuff comes on. And before we know it, these trucks are going by and people are blessing us with fruit. And that night we found 2 new species of Coca and a new species of Brunfelsia. And then we did this super heroic dose, as your brother would say, just before Tim and I split up after 12, 14 months together on the beaches of Peru and south of Lima. And I saw Tim die. I mean, I saw Tim, like Icaros, fly to the sun. And we flew together, and I knew he was going to die. And sure enough, he died. And not long, that it's almost, it was that. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that these substances, properly used, and I don't mean properly used in a kind of a bourgeois sense, but used with reverence, used with openness, the old set and setting thing, as tools of transformation. They've been doing this to human beings forever, and hopefully they will continue to do that for people forever.
Yes, I hope so too. Tim, I never had the privilege to work closely with Tim, but Tim was extremely kind to me when I was getting ready to go to the Amazon, when I was still in British Columbia getting ready to go. He came and talked to the graduate students, gave, of course, an incredible talk about Coca. And we kind of joked because the graduate students had a Coke machine. So this was Tim's lecture on Coca was funded by the by the Coke machine in the graduate student lounge.
Well, the funniest thing is we're at the Botanical Museum. We're the only legal importers of coca leaves besides Coca-Cola. Yeah. And we had bushels of the stuff, and we were all chewing through the stash for about 4 years, and then suddenly the DEA wanted it all back, or the Department of Agriculture. And for 4 years, we had been saving our quids. We put all our quids back in, added some water to the thing, and ended up giving the government by weight more coca than we had checked out 4 years before.
And they never caught it.
But Tim was so incredible as a botanist. He was one of a handful of botanists who could change botanical history just by holding a blossom to the light.
Yeah, just by doing what he did. After I completed my collecting in South America, got back to UBC, so I had all these specimens. And this was not the age of the internet. We had the mail, and I would send the photographs of the specimens to Tim for determination, and he would always come back. He would send me a postcard, but it was always a postcard. You can't hear me?
Yeah.
You can't hear me? Nobody can hear me? What is
the sound is perfect now. We can hear you. We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Wade cannot hear me? Your mic is muted, Wade. I show your mic muted. Huh. What do we do, Danielle? So sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can Wade hear me? I think he can't hear you, Danielle. He can't hear me.
Wade, can you hear us?
No, I think he's lost his audio.
Thanks for your patience. I'm just going to check in with Wade and get his mic turned back on.
Okay. I mean, it's that he cannot hear me, Danielle. You can hear me. I guess everyone can hear me, but he can't hear me. And I can't hear him either. Can you say something? Okay.
Thanks for your patience, Dennis. We're just getting Wade to reconnect his audio.
Yeah. Shall we go to questions now? I mean, okay, how is it now?
Can you hear me? No?
You can't hear me?
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I can't. I know.
I can hear you.
I have no.
Did you try refreshing your page?
I just did.
Okay.
I'm sorry. This is frustrating for everybody.
It is. This is the way it is. You can hear me though, right?
Yes, Dennis, we can hear you. We just can't hear Wade, so we're trying to.
I can't hear I can't hear Dennis.
And Wade cannot hear Dennis.
Shall I go out, Danielle?
Stay right there, Dennis. Thank you for your patience, and we're just going to figure this out with Wade. One moment. Thank you.
All right, so Wade, you said your mic is completely disconnected.
Well, it's connected. Without me touching anything, so it must be.
Okay, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Magic.
I can't hear Dennis.
Okay, that's what I thought. So what'll I do, Danielle? Go out and come back in?
Try refreshing your page as well.
I just, okay. You want me to
Dennis, try
refresh?
refreshing your page. Thank you for your patience. All right, Wade, we're just waiting for Dennis to come back on the screen.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Wade?
I'm still not hearing Dennis.
What a mess.
Well, maybe we can try to do one question at a time.
Yeah. Do you want to let Wade talk for a bit? You can take me offline, and we'll try and straighten this out.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Is my voice coming through at all?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes, and we can hear Dennis.
Okay. I can't hear Dennis.
Someone said Wade has laptop speakers activated and not his headset. So someone said you can hear both. I don't know what's going on.
All right, well, why don't we start off with a question for Wade?
Okay, but okay.
And then we are going to get this situation with your mic, Dennis, and so that Wade can see you figured out.
Okay, he's got his mic on. Someone said. Everyone can hear Wade. Is that right?
Correct. Okay, so
Yeah.
Wade.
Okay, everyone can hear me, but Wade can't hear me. So.
Now I'm listening to you on my iPhone, Danielle.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm hearing anything through my computer.
What a mess. Okay, well let's go with that then, and we'll have some questions, and then we'll go to the breakout room. I'm so sorry. This is not the way it's supposed to be.
Yep, and we're doing our best. We're breaking the internet with 6,000 people, and
we understand.
We will figure this out. So Wade, I'm entirely enamored by your writing, your speaking, and your stories. What, if anything, did you learn from Terence that was most important to you? And did he have any effect on your work and the way you communicate?
I wouldn't say that Terence's writing impacted me. I think, as I said earlier, to me, the impact that I just sort of felt more like a comrade with Terence. I loved his use of language. I loved his humor. I loved what I really loved, in a sense, was the dynamic between the two brothers. You had these two characters who came out of the same womb with many of the same aspirations, but approaching the issue so differently. I remember once at a Bioneers event in California, Terence and Dennis and I shared a panel together, and I was in the middle of these two characters, and I felt like their brains were just kind of vibrating in some kind of cyberspace or something, and the electrical pulses were going through me in the middle. It was such a wonderful presentation because we complemented each other in so many different ways. I mean, if you think about it, Terence is very much the philosopher. He's the one who takes these substances and imagines, sometimes stretching the realm of reality or even of plausibility, as he takes us out on these sort of speculative journeys. And like any philosopher who moves to the edge of the plausible or the possible, he sometimes trips over into the nonsensical. But then all that's precisely because he's walking that line. And then there you had Dennis, so utterly grounded in the science. And I learned so much from Dennis about ethnopharmacology that I never learned at Harvard. And then my role was always that of the the anthropologists. And the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. And when we did converge together on the Rio Ampiaco, which incidentally means the river of poisons, it was very interesting, the three of us, because on the one hand, as Dennis said earlier in our conversation, Terence kept trying to drive his sort of agenda, his polemic with the mushrooms. I mean, he really wanted to spend that entire sojourn on the upper reaches of the Ampiaco in his hammock, taking mushrooms by night and talking about them by day. Dennis had very serious scientific field work to accomplish under the most difficult of circumstances and frustrating of circumstances, because it didn't turn out that the key to the puzzle he was investigating was as accessible or immediate or as obvious as one might have thought in his research design. I, meanwhile, was enamored of what was going on in the Maloca, because, in fact, as we arrived there, it was on the eve of one of these extraordinary seasonal rituals whereby Malocas, or communities from vast distances across the forest, communicate with each other by signal drums. And one Maloca is charged with the duty of creating the fermented chicha, or the beer from the palm, and providing the dance masks, and the others provide the meat and other contributions. And these are these sort of annual, very important rituals that bring people together from distant reaches of the Amazon. If you go further north into the northwest Amazon, into the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, there you, in fact, have a very complicated marriage rule, which we call linguistic exogamy, which dictates that you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And that means that in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but nobody speaks a different tongue. They simply wait, watch. I mean, as children, they wait, watch, and listen, and one day begin to speak. But in mythological time, they believe that each language represents the siblings that came up a sacred canoe on the Milk River from the east, dragged by the Anaconda. And so those who inhabit a particular river and speak the same language are by definition siblings. So to marry amongst your own language would be to commit incest. And that also then facilitates networks of trade that facilitate peace and exchange and so on. So, you know, that the fact that we were there on the eve of this incredible event was absolutely enchanting to me. And I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in Terence's charming pontifications about mushrooms coming from space to give us religion. It just didn't seem relevant to me, given that we were there in the midst of this extraordinary ethnographic opportunity. So I ultimately took my hammock out of the cabins where we were staying by the waterfront, and I just moved into the Maloca with the Huitoto.
Yeah, it's true. Terence had his own agenda, and eventually we had to shut it down. I mean, he got some people to take the medicine, but that's not what we were there for, you know. And so, you know, it's very interesting. But
in case you can hear me, I can't hear Dennis. Just so you know.
Okay. What do we do, Danielle? Shall we go to questions?
Yeah.
Or what?
We're still in question mode. This is great. And I'll just communicate to Wade separately when it's his turn to speak.
Yeah, I'm hearing you now through the iPhone, just so you know.
Yes.
Okay.
It seems as though this dynamic is what we're working with until 4:10. We have about 20 more minutes. So let's continue with answering questions, if that's okay with you, Dennis.
Yeah. Yes, but if Wade can hear me, before we go into that, I would like to ask you, Wade, about your new book, which I understand publication is delayed, but it's supposed to come out next week, right?
So Wade,
can you tell us something about that? I'm sure it's going to be amazing.
Dennis is asking about your new book, and we'd love to hear about it, and we heard it's coming out soon.
Oh, Well, yeah, I've always loved Colombia, and the book that Dennis referred to, One River, has a really interesting kind of recent history in Colombia. It came out in English in 1996, but it came out in Colombia in the year 2002, at a time when Colombia's very capacity to survive as a nation state was being called into question. And suddenly appears in this small edition this book on botany, and the in Spanish came out about 150 pages longer than it was in English. But its great strength was that it was translated by a wonderful Colombian poet, Nicolas Sescuan. And the book, unbeknownst to me, took on a life of its own, and particularly for two generations of young people who were not free to travel in their own country because of the conflict, it became kind of a map of dreams, even as it celebrated the truth about the country, as opposed to the dark cliches. And the book took on almost, it's not just that it was a well-received book, it took on almost magical resonance. I mean, when the National Library of Colombia picked the first 25 of the 100 most important books in the history of the country, One River was one of the 25. And I was then invited back to Colombia in a very serendipitous way to help support a series of books that were being done celebrating the biodiversity of the country, books that weren't to be sold, but given as sets to every library in the country to send a message to a new generation of Colombians that theirs was not a nation of war or violence, but was a homeland of the greatest biodiversity, the greatest concentration of biodiversity on the planet. And I, in a very casual way, one day said, well, now we've covered the landscape, let's look into the rivers. And before I knew it, one of Colombia's greatest corporate citizens had agreed to support my entire research as I went about to tell the story of the Rio Magdalena, the Mississippi of Colombia, the river that it really made possible the country itself, given its difficult geography. And so I spent 5 years traveling this river that is both a corridor of commerce and also a fountain of culture, the repository and the fountain of poetry and prayer and music. And the book becomes more than just it's not a travel book as much as a biography of the country. And as Hector Abad, who's one of Colombia's greatest writers, said about it, and Hector's well known in part because of the tragic assassination of his father, one of the killings that truly shook the entire nation, and it made Hector sort of famously bitter about his nation, even hateful of his own country. And in the endorsement of the book, in a very beautiful way, Hector says that the book Magdalena, River of Dreams, is one that could even make him love his country again. So it's a very, very beautiful testimony to a country that hasn't deserved its agonies. You know, if you think about it, a country of 52 million people, yes, it suffered conflict, 220,000 dead, 100,000 missing, 7 million people internally displaced. How would Americans feel if their drug policies and their patterns of consumption of a drug led to over 85 million Americans being forced to flee their homes? Well, that's what cocaine and the American consumption, the global consumption of cocaine, did to the Colombian people. Yet in all of that time, there were never more than 200,000 combatants. So in a country of 52 million people, the Colombians were, by the vast majority, victims of a conflict that was not of their making. And yet during all those years, the nation managed to maintain democracy, civil society, green its cities, seek restitution with indigenous people unlike any other nation state, and create millions of acres of national parks. And now Colombia is posed on the precipice of an extraordinary breakthrough as two generations of young people are coming back finally to their homelands with skill sets earned and discovered and learned in every conceivable endeavor in every capital of the world. So Colombia is very much on the edge of a new beginning. And so in this sense, the book Magdalena is a prayer for an entire nation. It is indeed a love letter to the country, and it's by far the most important book I've ever written, by far the best book I've ever written. And it's all part of my overall effort these days to do everything I can to help a nation that gave me my start as a boy, as a scholar, and a nation that has not deserved its agonies. It was because of these efforts that I was very fortunate to be honored by President Juan Manuel Santos, the winner, of course, of the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2019, by becoming an honorary citizen, which he did in a very beautiful ceremony in the Palacio Nariño in 2018. And so the book is just one of my many initiatives to try to tell the world the truth about this extraordinary country of Colombia.
That's fantastic, Wade. If you say, I don't know if, I guess you're hearing me through the phone, but if you say that it's the best book, in your opinion, you've ever written, that's going to be some book, because, you know, I've read most of what you've written and they're beautiful. If this is equivalent to One River, that's really an accomplishment. And so tell us, when will we be able to get into this? I can't wait to delve into this book.
Wade, when will we be able to delve into this book?
Oh, well, you know, like all of us, we all had these complicated schedules that went to the car wash with the new pandemic. The book was to have been scheduled for April 14th, but, you know, the bookstores are closed, the distribution networks are shut down. Publishers can't even find paper to print the books. So Knopf's entire list, I believe, or certainly many books, were punted towards September. So the book will formally come out in September and be widely available both in the UK, US, Canada, and then it'll be coming out in the Spanish edition with Planeta in Bogota in probably December.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we're waiting. We're waiting for that, definitely. So, do you want to go to questions, Danielle?
Yes, let's go to questions. And I have Wade on my phone, if you can hear me. So there's a question around, long ago, Terence talked about Kratom, which has since been extremely popular and a huge help to the world. It's completely banned, or it'll be continue to banned. If we can prove that Kratom was sold and consumed since October 1994, the FDA will back down the entire Kratom community. Thoughts?
Well, you know, I just don't know anything about that substance, so I think I'd turn that question back to Dennis.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that a little bit. So Kratom or Kratom, Mitragyna speciosa, is not a psychedelic. It's actually an opiate. It contains alkaloids that hit the same receptors that morphine and heroin and these things interact with. So it's used in Thailand as an analgesic, sometimes as a substitute for opium. Sometimes it's given to people to help them get off opium or heroin because it's less addictive. You know, but it is also possibly it's also possible to abuse it because, like any opiate, it can produce dependence. What's interesting about the Mitragyna alkaloids from the standpoint of pharmacology is it represents a structural class that definitely active on the opiate receptors, but it does not cause respiratory depression. And respiratory depression is what kills people. That's why they die of opiate overdoses, respiratory depression. These alkaloids do not do that. So why the pharmaceutical industry is not already all over this, I'm quite puzzled by, because the holy grail in terms of looking for effective analgesics is to find an opiate that doesn't cause this toxicity, and it is one of those. If you look at the symposium I helped organize in 2017 called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. Wade was a co-editor on this. There's an excellent article in there about Kratom by a medicinal chemist who has been working on this. So if you do a search on the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, or ESPD 50, that should come up. And I can put in the chat box once I get to it. There, the videos, the video lectures from that symposium are all online, and I'll send out that link after we get offline here, so people can look at that. It's a very interesting plant, you know, and like many of these plants, it's exotic, it's outside the culture, and people hear opiate, oh, it must be terrible. Actually, this is not part of the opiate problem. Mitragynine potentially is part of the opiate solution, and it should be looked at more closely. It's very much in parallel to the way Coca is regarded. We in the West, we only see Coca and cocaine as some terrible scourge. Actually, Coca, the plant, is an incredibly benign plant. It's very good for the people who use it traditionally, as a plant, not to extract cocaine from it. I mean, that's a desecration of the plant, and we know what that's done to, destabilize cultures and so on. The people that are trafficking in cocaine are doing the farthest thing from honoring this plant, which has been, an incredibly important medicine for most likely about 10,000 years, Wade, something like that. Coca has been known for many, many years. So mitragynine there needs to be more research.
Thank you, Dennis. And Wade, we're going to go into a question specifically for you.
Can you hear me, Wade?
Yep.
People are a huge fan of your work, love your books, and aspire to live as rich of a life as yours. What advice do you have for young enthusiasts who wish to do real ethnobotanical field work? Similarly, as to how you asked your mentor, Schultes, for guidance, I too am asking you where to start. What credentials do I need?
Well, I think, I get asked all the time that question, and I try to do everything I can to help young people. When I went to see Schultes, it's not as if he gave me a scholarship or he didn't, he facilitated the possibility of doing what I was doing. But as a young person, I really had no credentials. And he was just very generous with any young person who came his way. But I basically was on my own. I remember he gave me 2 letters that, of course, might as well have been written by God, or at least by Charles Darwin, for the doors that they would open. But I had saved up money by myself in a logging camp. I arrived in Bogota with a one-way ticket, no plans whatsoever, only a certainty that I was not going to come back to the United States until Richard Nixon was no longer president. I had a small backpack of clothes, and I was going to be on the road for at least a year. And I remember, even as a young boy, getting off the airplane and sort of watching that foot actually touch the ground, and I almost froze because what next? Well, what is next is the next foot moving, and one step at a time, and that's how life is. I think when you're young, you just have to kind of go do it. And then through the experience that you accumulate, that becomes the beginning of a kind of a resume of credentials that, before you know it, are beginning to be the building blocks of a career. I mean, I think the most important thing to remember as a young person is that the greatest challenge in life is to become the architect of that life. You know, when those people who are embittered in old age invariably are those who look back upon a life of choices imposed upon them by their family, parents, society, or whatever. And those who seem to be content are those who look back on a life in which they have been the ones who have made the decisions, maybe not all good or bad, but they've been in control of their destiny. You know, despair is kind of an insult to the imagination. Orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. You kind of have to just do what needs to be done and then ask whether it was possible. And one thing I would say to young people as well, and Dennis raised this in an email asking about what we were going to talk about, and he was going to say, you know, what would Terence think of what had happened in the world in the intervening 20 years since he checked out? And my answer to that is, I don't think Terence would think anything of what has happened in the world in the last 20 years. I don't think anything that has happened would have come to him as a surprise. And there's a lesson in that. I remember once I was with Mathieu Ricard, a very well-known French scholar and Tibetan monk, and we were in with a man called Trusik Rinpoche, who was a spiritual heir of Zatro Rinpoche of the Rongbuk Monastery on the northern slopes of Everest. And we went by Russian helicopter back to the hermitage where Trosig Rinpoche had lived for 3 years in a cave as he fled the Chinese in 1959 before going on to build the Tupten Sholin monastery. And as we helped this very elderly man up this steep slope from where we landed with a helicopter, we sat to rest as he began to give us a kind of darshan of the Four Noble Truths. And I asked him at the end of that, well, what was it like to be back after 40 years in this place that had been so important to him? And he just sort of looked around and he said one word. He said, same. Here's the point. Things don't really change. You know, we have this thing in our Christian tradition of good and evil, and there's always this kind of idea that eventually good will triumph over evil. You know, the fallen archangel, the devil will be crushed by the Son of God. And we run our lives waiting for that day. But that's kind of unusual. If you think of, you know, in the Vedic scriptures, famously when Lord Krishna was asked by a disciple the famous heresy, if God's all-powerful, why does he allow evil to exist in the universe? And of course, if you ask that question in medieval Europe, you were burned at the stake. But when Lord Krishna was asked that by a student, he simply said, to thicken the plot. And of course, this is the idea that there is always good, there is always evil, and neither is going to go away. And the great struggle in life is to decide what side of that divide you want to be on. My father, who was a good and decent man, but by no means a religious individual, used to say to me as a little kid, son, there's good and evil, take your pick and get on with it. And I think that gives you a very powerful tool as a young person. You know, bitterness comes to those who keep thinking they're going to make that revolution, keep thinking they're going to bring in this new era of goodwill or whatever, you know. And I felt that way as a young person, and it was very frustrating until I realized I was never going to achieve that, and that the goal is not to vanquish evil, it's to be on the path of good, and that life itself as is a pilgrimage, and the destination is not a place, it's a state of mind. And when you adopt that kind of attitude, you just keep going. And that's at least how I can explain how at the age of 66, after having done as many things as I've done and exposed to as much as I've seen, I still maintain an almost childlike sense of curiosity about the world. I'm always thinking of what the next book is going to be, never about what I've written in the past. And I think that's a good attitude to try to adopt, that life is not a destination. It's not a goal. It's a state of being.
Yeah, very wise words. Very wise words indeed. I think, yes, curiosity. Curiosity is, I think, if I had to look back on my own life, why did you get interested in psychedelics? Why did you go down this path? Just driven by curiosity. You know, there was, and I think curiosity is what drives science. Curiosity is what drives Wade or someone like him to not ask a lot of questions. Am I going to be safe? What if I do this? What if I, jump off this cliff or whatever? He's had many opportunities. He told me I asked him once, you've done all these incredible things, in all different parts of the world, and things that would curl the toes of most people. How did you do it? And he said, I just say yes to everything, and I think that's that's courageous, maybe foolhardy, but look at the experiences that he's had. The rest of us could wish to have such a rich life, in terms of the places you've gone and the people. And I think it's about curiosity, and it's about courage, and it's about just being open to whatever is going to happen. That's how learning happens. If you got those things, doesn't matter, what the context is that you're doing, whether it's academic or corporate or whatever. Not everyone can become an ethnobotanist or become an ethnopharmacologist, but you can find a path and follow it. And, I often counsel students, like Wade. I get lots of young people coming to me and I say, where do I go? I want to get involved in this thing. I just say, whatever puts a fire in your belly, go for that. Don't worry about your academic success or your financial success or whatever. Make an interesting life for yourself. The rest of it will take care of itself. So we're very much on the same page when it comes to that philosophy, so I think this may be a good point to end the questions, unless you wanted to do one or two more. By the way, I put a link to the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs, the videos. You can listen to all those videos at the link I put in, including the presentation on Kratom, which is the reason I put it up there. But it's actually covers a lot of territory, lots of good listening or watching there. So Danielle, do you want to do another question, or you want to wrap it up here and go to the break room?
We're about at time now, and thank you so much, Dennis. Wade, we are just about to wrap it up here, and Dennis was speaking about the fire that's lit and guiding people to really discover their inner fire and their energy as they go down this path. So as we come to a close, Wade, where can people find you? Oh,
in what sense?
Online, where can people follow up about your work and find your new book?
I think if just people Google Wade Davis Anthropologist, dozens and dozens of hundreds of pages. All the books are there. Films. I do have a website that I'm pretty poor at.
WadeDavis.com, right?
But I think if you just Google Wade Davis Anthropologist, and on my website, I've pirated lots of films there that I've made. So, but there's one film that people might want to check out on Netflix, The Path of the Anaconda, El Sendero de la Anaconda, and that's readily available on Netflix. And that film we made, and it became the top documentary in the history of Colombia. And so in terms of people seeing.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Wade, for being here and being such a trooper through this experience with the sound. And we look forward to hearing more of your voice and sharing your wisdom in future events.
Thanks a lot, Danielle, for all your patience and help. Okay. Give a big kiss to Dennis for me. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
well,
Wade.
Dennis.
Thanks for
Yeah.
everything. I'll be talking to you. Thanks so much, and thanks for your patience. Sorry the tech was so iffy, but I think people got the message. So, ciao, ciao.
And we'll figure it out for next time. You know, we're all learning this new program and is a work in progress. Dennis, do you have any last words to this beautiful community?
Excuse me, run it.
Do you have any last words for the community before we break out into groups?
Well, I guess my my almost parting last words is join us next Saturday for the next and final installment in what's turned out to be a really amazing series of conversations, even with all the technical problems. So next weekend, next Saturday, starting at noon, like they all do, we'll have Rupert Sheldrake and Ralph Abraham. And they're also old friends of Terence. And it's going to be a different kind of format this time, slightly, because Ralph and Terence and Rupert used to go to Esalen a lot, and they over the 90s when they were there together, they developed this thing called trialogues at the edge of the West. And 2 books came out of that, and these were just lively conversations, 3 very brilliant minds just shooting the breeze, as it were, and talking to each other very freely. And so we're not exactly going to try to reproduce that, because I can't step into the role that Terence filled, but we're going to bring Rupert and Ralph together. And so we'll have another 3-way conversation. It won't be sequential like it is here. And, you know, I hope that you can join us next Saturday and look into that. Have a look at the McKenna Academy website, www.mckenna.academy, and the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. And I just want to thank everybody that's come in. 6,400 people. This is not a bad attendance. So thank all of you who are listened and participated and make this happen. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Are there going to be breakout rooms, Danielle?
Yes, there are, Dennis, and thank you for really putting this together. And we will break out into groups, and I will give the instructions of how people get to their groups.
Okay, I'll stick around. I'll have a look at those, but I'll probably exit the stage pretty soon here. So again, thanks for everything.
Thanks, Dennis, and
okay.
We'll catch up with you soon. Wow, thank you, everyone. It was so lovely to hear Wade so clearly in his stories, and thank you, Dennis, for putting this event together. It's really been an honor to celebrate the life and legacy together. So we are going into our breakout sessions. As Dennis mentioned, be sure to catch our final date on April 18th with Rupert and Ralph. Each speaker today has shared such cherished life experiences with Terence, inspiring the change they lead today with their communities and the world. We celebrate the evolutionary progression of consciousness made possible by the lives and our predecessors. And I'd like to leave you with this: how can we contribute to a legacy for future generations? All right, so now we're going to move back into our breakout sessions, and just bringing you back to the house that we're in right now. We're going to be leaving the main auditorium and go out into our breakout session rooms. So for those that are new to Crowdcast, I'm going to bring up an instructional sheet and walk you through it. And thank you all. Just a deep bow of gratitude for all of you for tuning in today and being part of this experience. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of your weekend, and stay connected with the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy and with the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. It's been a true honor and privilege to share this experience with you today. So thank you. Much love, everyone. So if you are to how to get to a breakout session. So if you go to the top left corner of your browser, click for schedule, click the more ... And when you hit the more ... it'll bring you down to a drop-down menu where you can choose the breakout group of your choice. And feel free to go between rooms and find the room that resonates most with you. And once you enter the room, please be patient. Sometimes it takes a minute to enter the room. Let the speaker know that you are currently on stage or in the room so they can bring you up to the screen. So you can do that by typing into the room. And if you type in raise hand, then the facilitator can bring you up to the screen. These groups are facilitated by San Francisco Psychedelic Society team and volunteers. Also, if you're ready to go back onto the screen, it's recommended to check your audio and video. And feel free to enter the rooms at your leisure. And these breakout groups are going to last up to an hour. It's not going to be limited to a half an hour because this is our last program of the day. So thank you all so much for tuning in and sending a big love to you now. So take care.